Video 110. The ancient life stream of Singapore's founding Prime Minister, Lee Kuan Yew. As explained by the ancient spirit tralaka here, flowing here in spirit through the vocal cords of Groovy F. Now, this goes down a long stream, back into the ancient wars in the Draco many planetary systems. Here, particularly speaking of a winding war with the renegade empire fraction. Now, Lee spent 11 full lives in that Draco planetary system as a Dracan humanoid, averaging 9 feet 11 inches tall. Wow! Bristling pointed rows of upright scales from the top of his head to his shoulders. They varied in color from green to maroon. His larger eyes were mid-shine green. The Draco humanoid body, though, was a mid-tone swirled green, where you could see small lines of browns and blacks. That first life Lee spent as a fighter pilot on a small planet which had many refugees from that large war, finding hiding spots on the outlying small planets that were still able to maintain life, yet not grab much attention because of their distance from many of the main shipping lines of cargo, where the ships would come out of hyperspace or a variable wormhole or orbiting stargates. This kept Lee and the crews he was with of that 4 small squadrons of wide-line space fighter crafts very, very busy in weekly attempts to sneak in between those different warring zones in space with small cargo ships of new refugees tucked very tightly within the formation of those wide-line fighter crafts. Though those wide-line fighter crafts were fast, they were very sadly in disrepair and so much damage from their battles. In Lee's next 7 lives, he would be a military warrior for the renegade empire of the Draco Dragons, which had a different variables of Draco humanoid, which had pledged to aid that renegade Draco Dragons in that winding long war. At 9 feet 8 inches tall, Lee looked pure fighting warrior. Rippling Draco coarse muscles rippled under his fully tattooed mid-tone skin. Being part of the Gurbasely warriors, it was their job to make sure that no one from ground level, in the air, or by waters could get close to the main headquarters of the renegade Draco Dragons Empire, for it was there where the meetings for the commanders from the many different bases, both planet-size and in different star systems, would come for meetings. This was a very deadly occupation to have. The next 9 lives Lee would have on the planet Tiamat, otherwise known as Maladek. In those lives, he averaged 8 foot 6.5 inches. He was a Draco humanoid in those first 4, of which he spent as a highly trained cook, which was part of the cooking teams that made the meals for the big leaders and for the meetings between the different variables of species on Tiamat, who would be trying to broker deals between different groups even on Tiamat. Now, the last 5 lives on Tiamat, Lee Kuan Yew spent much time as a warrior in enforcing squadrons in those times, which was a very difficult job to try to keep peace in the communities between the average citizens and the different variables of ruling dictators. Now, there was in those times, Lee spent on Tiamat a great swelling of disapproval between the different caste systems of citizens with the leaders on the planetary levels of Tiamat. Now, this was a pure classic case of too many generations of propaganda, false programming in efforts to control the workers, which was now crumbling and the workers were waking up. While visitors from places like the Pleiadian planetary system and others were coming to Tiamat to try to aid in what they said was the coming collapse into many wars within wars on planet side and off planet of Tiamat. For the representatives of the Pleiades understood that the pin-headed beings who lived yet on those two planets past the orbit of Pluto were about ready to come in with huge warring ships and take out from Tiamat what they wanted and then leave that planetary system altogether for elsewhere in the living universe. To other planetary systems they have also very long time controlled. Well, at least they thought they so well controlled. Nevertheless, the battle for getting the citizens to think rationally and stop believing the lies from the Greys and the tall pin-headed beings, as well as the local lizard beings and reptilian beings. This here was going to be a losing battle of information for groups like from the Pleiades and outlying systems of Draco, dragons who still taught the ancient wisdom of peace and of healing from within. Now, for Lee, this was going to be the hardest of his lives that he has known as of yet. Holding true to the law while still keeping all sides from mass killings. Truly, this was not a 9-to-5 job, but a 24/7 service he wouldn't get paid half of. Though when a person looks at Lee Kuan Yew's ancient live streams, it would seem at that time that was the end of Lee's lives on the planet Tiamat. However, this was not the case, for the information has come forth as of very shortly of this moment that Lee was to spend another 3 more lives on Tiamat, standing at only 3 foot 10 inches tall, a little munchkin, and a non-humanoid form. The second life being cut rather short. His form, when looked upon, seemed to be more of a lizard being, although you could tell some reptilian characteristics in his looks. Though he walked upright as humanoids do, now there is so different many variations of reptilian and lizard beings. Now, there are those who are the intelligent mindsets versus those who are of the insanity mindsets of lizard beings and reptilian beings. Now, most of those species of which are of the insanity-based beings. Now here, usually walking of those insanity beings on all 4 feet, meaning hands and feet. Though some being able to stand upright as a humanoid during battle or conversation with the humanoids, which many of the lizard beings and reptilian beings barely could tolerate. But they could not walk fast without dropping to run using hands and feet. However, here in this case of Lee Kuan Yew, standing at 3 foot 10 inches tall, when his ears were combed back, lying flat on his head. Otherwise, his height, with ears pointing upwards, was 4 foot 1.5 inches tall. I suppose for him, this was very important, this second numbers. The ancient life stream records that he was part of a military warrior group that was on Tiamat undercover, under contract for work. But for whom were they working for? Whom were they working for? There were so many different fractions of species and variables on Tiamat during any given time during much of Tiamat's history. So who was providing the paychecks here? Hence the old saying, you don't have to be tall to be bad. For this came in the flavors of information hacking from the data centers as well as the space-going ships that had parked in the many harbors on Tiamat. It was well known that Tiamat for so long was a very large hub for illegal drugs and illegal merchandise trading that were either made on Tiamat or was coming or going from other hubs within the somewhat local star systems. Now, that group that Lee was in had the job to blend in and work in both the legal businesses that were trading on Tiamat and also some of those selected that were dealing with illegal drugs and merchandise. Now, while this shows a very tight group that Lee was in, the other officers averaged 7 feet to 9 feet in height, in which they were very easily able to blend in with other species in the business and not attract attention. While Lee, on the other hand, as his short height was perfect for being able to be put into just the right areas. He could pretty much roll up into a ball and blend into or next to that custom fitting backpacks of those officers. Now, Lee was a mid-tone black with a 5-foot tail. Now, that was more thin, which he would usually keep at least wrapped twice around his waistline. His tail was very strong, however, as well as lightning quick. Though the big difference between Lee and others of his lizard and reptilian species was that the end of Lee's tail was electrified, being able at lightning speeds to knock somebody out from giving them shock. Or he could also have those high power flowing through the end of the tail to electrocute beings. In remote situations, he was also known to be able to send off a charge of electricity through the air from his tail to a foe, as long as they were relatively within 8 feet, or at least within a straight line direction for that charge to go. Needless to say, what damage he could and did so many times create in those data centers and ships and even harbor ship points and even harbors was purely legendary within his group and whoever was associated with his group. Now, Lee was at 3 foot 10 inches of destruction, which infuriated so many different beings. Though he was not part of the lineage of the lizard or reptilian beings that have for so many millions of years hung around the Neptune to Saturn area of Earth's planetary system. Although he called home a planetary system that lurked very deep in the black darkness of space between the Draco systems and the Procyon systems. Lots of room out there, lots of darkness. Lee could roll up like a ball and attach himself by means of his tail as on the side of his fellow officer's backpack and blend in. Once inside of a sensitive area, he would uncoil as those officers were removing or opening the heavy lids or doors of the sensitive data centers. Many times, Lees would then be able to stand up fully inside and even run inside in some of these very large centers between different data ports on the inside and figured out the software and hardware of the center and what he needed to do, while the officers were working to distract or remove by means of clever ideas that the others may be coming close to where Lee was working to protect Lee. From time to time, Lee would end up within great-sized space-going cargo ships' data centers. For some time, in some of these remote situations, it would take him quite a while to be able to get and harvest the information needed. Lee was so effective Yet he had a sense of humor. From time to time, when he harvested the information, he would leave a short video of an animated humanoid running around in circles, chasing themselves like a dog chasing a tail on a monitor screen. On the main news station of Tiamat, here's a very short video which I am going to explain, which shows up in his ancient stream, that showed a standoff between Lee in one of those 3 lives and the crew of an illegal drug-running space cargo ship. Now, this was only aired once, but it was still in record here in Lee's live stream somehow. You know, in that situation, Lee was in all of his great height of 3 foot 10 inches, standing on top of a large circular computer center of that space-going ship, where much of the crew worked the computers of that ship for things like navigation and taking care of the ship. The height of the main control deck room of that cargo ship was 15 feet. So this allowed different height of operators as well as crew members and massive amounts of information. Now, the back of the computers stood at 8 feet tall. An open data door in which Lee had emerged from still was shaking in the breeze of his coming through. He was then standing very firm on his feet with so sharp claws, actually being able to dig into the material that those cabinets for those computers was made of. His tail end, 10 inches, was glowing this big fire orange ball that illuminated all the air around him. He had already stripped off all the information he had needed from this ship, even though they were close to going to hyperspace, because this ship was reworked in a design for running drugs and had a backup control for running the ship's navigation controls. Now, Lee could not have possibly prepared for this, even with his vast amounts of data knowledge. Now, a dozen of those ship's officers being shown in this short video that was being shown me, pointing high caliber weapons at Lee. Lee's tail was now shaking from keeping such a charge so long. Lee smiled. For what seemed an eternity. "You cannot possibly think you can beat me, much less kill me." His Chester Cheetah smile, the last thing that news screen clearly seen as Lee quickly leaped upwards in that control room in just a flash of light and unleashing from that high electricity from his tail in mind-numbing speeds over and over and over and over and over and over again, smoke filling in the airs between Lee and his opponents from those discharge of the energy from his tail. A combination of laser fire and old-fashioned gunshots lit the air between the streaks of orange in the smoky environment. A brief few seconds of clarity showed 9 of that ship's crew dead, slumped over their weapons. The last 3 reloading as Lee swung from ceiling light to ceiling light fixture, rifling off bolt after bolt of energy from his tail. A few seconds later, the rest of that ship's crew were dead. Lee, in his last release from an overhead light fixture, performed a triple flip while he was winding his tail back around his waistline, standing at his full 2 feet, walking calmly over to the back of one of the computer data centers, which still had its data port door open, and activating a micro-sized homing beacon. Lee shook himself briefly, then let out a loud and yet very calm voice. "Time to lunchroom dive to fix this huge appetite." The smile back on his face, Lee walked away from that hidden camera. Behind him, he left a room of smoke and scattered villains and weapons that were still cooling off in the airs. The computer screens for so much of that computer deck having holes in them from many missed shots and much of poor aiming of those illegal drug running space crew. Some had even exploded from bolts from Lee's tail in that very deadly but short firefight. In Lee's next 4 lives, he would be in the planet Mars' ancient past as a Draco humanoid standing at 9 feet 1 inch. What a change in height! Walking and working for the private businesses, very tied in with them, being a fully trained fighter pilot of both airbound fighter crafts and space-going fighter crafts. Lee could provide protection for high technology shipments which were coming and going from his customers' businesses. At times, Lee's would be spacebound for long periods, protecting the space freighters until they managed to go into hyperspace, though he preferred this, the space flights, versus being on the surface of the planet Mars. For here, the lines of right and wrong was less complicated and so much harder to go back to later to find evidence. The area between Tiamat and the 2 planets that used to be past Pluto was a very angry beehive of issues. Yet, Lee found great joy in providing protection, coming and going through those areas. This here is the ancient spirit, tralaka. Harmonize with the living universe within your lives. Release pent-up emotions to allow for more harmonious energies to flow within your lives and your environment. Good night.